The federal minimum wage doesn't accomplish the goals for which it was designed and should be eliminated. It's arguable whether the federal minimum wage is even constitutional, and when it's set at the federal level, it's an incredibly blunt instrument. On top of that, many cities and states have stepped in and set a minimum wage of their own, and at the end of the day, a minimum wage really just hurts the people that it was designed to help the most. When the federal government sets a minimum wage, it interferes with people's freedom of contract. It is telling employees and employers that they cannot negotiate a wage that's lower than the minimum wage, even if both of them were to find that beneficial. In Adkins versus the Children's Hospital of the District of Columbia, the Supreme Court said the minimum wage law was simply and effectively a price-fixing law. And even though that was overturned a few years later, the original arguments for it still stands. Being able to negotiate whatever contract you want with whoever you want for any terms that you both find beneficial is a fundamental freedom that we should enjoy here in America. When set at the federal level, a minimum wage is an incredibly blunt instrument. It's the same all across the country, but the cost of living isn't the same everywhere. A living wage in Amarillo is much lower than a living wage in Manhattan or even Dallas would be. And because it's the same everywhere, a bump in the minimum wage gives more benefit to people in rural areas than it does in urban areas where the cost of living tends to be higher. Only about 4.7% of jobs are minimum wage jobs. And of the people working those jobs, they're not the people who are supporting a household. A minimum wage job typically is either the second or third income for a household. It's also tends to be more high school kids trying to buy gas money than parents trying to feed their children. And so the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage doesn't really put money where it needs to be. And it doesn't take into account the diversity of the economies we have across the country. 29 states in the District of Columbia have set a minimum wage that's higher than the current federal minimum wage. That means the people in those areas have decided that their markets demand that they pay people more than the federal government has. And while you can argue whether that's a good idea or not, at least in those markets, the wage is set to something that makes sense for those markets and not something that is blanket across the entire country. An additional 14 states have a minimum wage set to the same as the current federal minimum wage, which means if we were to abolish the federal minimum wage, all of those workers in all of those states wouldn't immediately be affected. And probably the biggest reason to get rid of the minimum wage is that it really hurts the people that it is designed to help the most. Econ 101 tells us that as prices go up, demand goes down. When it costs more to pay an employee, employers will hire fewer employees. Less jobs are going to be created. The CBO estimated that if Obama would have raised the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, it would have cost the economy 500,000 jobs. And while the labor market is a little bit more complicated than the goods markets you learn about in Econ 101, it's just foolish to think that this very basic principle doesn't apply to jobs. The inverse of that is that when it costs more to make something, companies have to sell it for more in order to maintain a profit. So when the minimum wage goes up, the cost of producing goods goes up and prices go up. So if you're one of the lucky few who didn't lose your job because of the minimum wage went up, or you're able to find a job, you still can't buy anymore because the prices of everything have gone up. And when we're looking at the poor and uneducated, the people we're trying to help the most with the minimum wage, those people tend to be the ones that have the hardest time competing in competitive job markets, which means when there's fewer jobs, they're going to be the people left in the unemployment line. So at the end of the day, an argument can be made about whether or not a minimum wage is even constitutional. Setting it at the federal level is just an incredibly blunt instrument that doesn't take into account the diversity of all the different markets we have across this country. If the federal government didn't set a minimum wage, the states and cities would step in and set one where appropriate. A lot of them already have. And at the end of the day, a minimum wage is really just hurting the people that it is designed to help the most.